Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 54 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, we are spending this series on Humphrey Carpenter's excellent book, The Inklings, and we're going to get back to those revised and expanded letters next series. Today, though, I'm going to continue our look at some of the differences between the friends who make up the Inklings. Now, last week we talked about the academic interests of the Inklings, only to find a wide range of viewpoints. And we also took a quick glance at another possible similarity, interest in magic and the occult, only to rule that out as the fox that might not be there. So let's return to Carpenter and look at the notion that their work was a, quote, movement which would in some way alter the course of literature, as we mentioned 2 weeks ago. Now, Carpenter points out that a poet by the name of John Wayne, that's W-A-I-N, not the American actor famous for Westerns and My Local Airport, made the case that the Inklings were a circle of instigators, almost of incendiaries, meeting to urge one another on in the task of redirecting the whole current of contemporary art and life. Honestly, that seems like a little projection. Now, Carpenter doesn't tell us much about Wayne, but my research shows that he was often referred to as part of the Angry Young Men, the 1950s writers who opposed the British establishment and conservative society. He was also linked with The Movement, a group of post-war poets. So a guy who clearly liked groups of writers trying to change things might just have wanted to see a group of writers as trying to change things. My point, though, anyway, C.S. Lewis was his tutor at Oxford, and that's how Wayne came to be a part of these Inklings meetings in the late 40s, even though he was never really in the Inklings. Lewis, having been his tutor, had no problem confronting him about this claim, basically saying it's not anywhere close to true. He says, this was undoubtedly an exaggeration, and Lewis took him to task for it, replying, the whole picture of myself as one forming a cabinet or cell or coven is erroneous. Mr. Wayne has mistaken purely personal relationships for alliances. But could there be a truth in the middle somewhere? Were the friendships between Tolkien, Lewis, Williams, Barfield, and others purely personal relationships, as Lewis wrote? Or was there something more, but still falling short of an alliance or a movement? Carpenter seems to think so, arguing that the truth lay somewhere between the two. Lewis was not so naive as to suppose that the Inklings could, merely by urging one another on, directly instigate a change of taste in art and life. On the other hand, Carpenter continues, Lewis undoubtedly believed that if a sufficient number of people were to read his friends' and his own books, they would be significantly affected by them. For example, he declared of The Lord of the Rings, wouldn't it be wonderful if it really succeeded in selling, It would inaugurate a new age. Dare we hope? And look, I can't disagree with that. If everybody read The Lord of the Rings, I imagine it would make a difference in their lives and the world would become a better place, even if just a little bit. Carpenter then moves on to this idea that the Inklings were a circle of incendiaries, lighting each other on fire to do what they did, right, inspiring one another. He makes the point that Tolkien and Williams, at the least, quote, would have written everything they wrote had they never heard of the group. And I can't really argue with that. But I would say that Tolkien took his friends' criticisms seriously, and he obviously made changes to his stories as a result. So would the work have been the same? Undoubtedly not. Now, as for Williams, I can't say. I'm afraid my knowledge of him is a bit more limited, so I'll have to rely on what Carpenter tells us. But going back to Tolkien, Carpenter makes the following point. Tolkien's imagination was fully fledged, and the fundamental body of his ideas was sketched out before he even met Lewis. As he himself declared, his debt to Lewis, quote, was not influence as it is ordinarily understood, but sheer encouragement. Well, that's a quote that Carpenter pulls from Letter 276 that was written to Dick Plotz in 1965. Now, for a little context, the rest of that statement reads that Lewis was for long my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. But for his interest and unceasing eagerness for more, I should never have brought The Lord of the Rings to a conclusion. So, for my opinion at least, Carpenter is stretching it a bit here to say that Tolkien would have written everything he wrote had they never heard of the Inklings. So, I don't know. I kind of see that there was some influence, but maybe not incendiary as John Wayne had suggested. Williams' work, similarly, was not greatly impacted by his involvement in the Inklings, at least according to Carpenter. He tells us that Williams' work was almost finished by the time he came to Oxford, and though he did benefit from the contact with the Inklings, this was of small importance in his life compared to what had gone before. He appreciated the criticism of the group, but they and their remarks had little effect on the work he did in Oxford, and the books he wrote there are not greatly different or markedly superior to those written towards the end of his time in London. Okay, I'm going to have to take his word on that. It was Lewis who Carpenter argues was influenced by Tolkien and Williams, not the other way around. And he says, Lewis, on the other hand, had not written many of his books before the Inklings began to meet, and there are elements in his later work which can be easily identified as bearing the mark of Tolkien or Williams. Perhaps, Carpenter suggests, Lewis tried to consciously take up the mantle of both writers. So maybe it is more personal and less of an alliance after all. Lewis wrote, "To be sure, we had a common point of view, but we had it before we met. It was the cause, rather than the result, of our friendship." For now, folks, this wraps up this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Be sure to join me again next week for more on the Inklings as we look more at the friendship between these men. In the meantime, please consider visiting patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can join the Content Council and be a part of deciding what I talk about. You also can support the show, get an ad-free feed, a bonus episode every week, and more. Join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe, follow or subscribe in your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.